Hello and welcome to the Independence Age Friday briefing. As you know, if you've joined us, coronavirus cases in the UK are on the rise, and there is an enormous amount of debate over what strategies we should be employing to tackle this. So here is an opportunity to hear from some truly independent scientists, and we will first of all have a presentation of facts and figures and then questions from some of our audience. So first of all, then, with no further ado, Dr. Kit Yates is going to present the latest figures. Kit, over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen and then put it on full screen so hopefully you can see it. There we go. Okay, so yeah, I'm delighted to be able to do the figures for this week, but I'm afraid that's where my delight ends because it's been another bad news week, unfortunately. This is what I'm going to cover in the next 5 or 10 minutes. And start by looking at testing, find, test, trace, isolate and support, how that's working out. Then move on to cases, case numbers, how they're increasing. Then talk about hospitalizations and deaths. And then I'm going to give a short international comparison to see where we sit in the European League table. And I'll finish by summarizing. So first slide is about test, trace and isolate in the UK. So there is some good news in that the median distance that someone had to travel to get a test in person has dropped from 3.7 miles to 3.3 miles this week, but that's about where the good news ends. So if you look at the red curve, it's suggesting that fewer than 30% of tests are received within 24 hours. I wanted to highlight the grey curve. These are complex cases that are reached. So that sounds like they're doing a good job finding difficult cases, but actually what this means is that the cases are given to local public health England health protection teams to track, and they're actually doing a really good job. And what it highlights is that we really need to be devolving find, test, trace, isolate to local regions who can do a better job of finding these contacts. If you look at the dark blue curve here, then you'll see again that the proportion of new cases that are actually being reached is low, about 77%. And then again in the yellow, of those people who actually cases that get contacted and pass their contact details on, fewer than 60% of their contacts are being traced. And so those two together don't sound too bad, 77% and just below 60%. But actually, you've got to remember that if you're thinking about the total proportion of contacts that need to be traced, you need to multiply those two things together. And that means that actually fewer than 45% of all the potential contacts of people who are referred to test, trace and isolate are being contacted. And that's not even taking into account the fact that not everyone who tests positive is referred to test, trace and isolate. And then the fact that of the people who are contacted, not all of them then go into isolation. So we really need to be providing better support for people to isolate, to make it easier for them to do what's necessary to keep on top of the spread. So that's test, trace and isolate. This next slide is a familiar one. It's a number of new cases. It's all too familiar at the moment. So the green is daily cases. They're edging up towards around 20,000 per day at the end of this week. And then the black is the 7-day average of those cases, and that's up at around 16,000. So you can see it's been rising week on week since July, and it's rising faster and faster as we would expect it to do. This is confirmed by, we just had the Office for National Statistics weekly study that just came out. Cases rose there from 17,200 in the previous reporting period to 27,900 in this week's reporting period. So a significant rise over the last week. That should be said that data is for England only, as is this data here. In terms of the number of new confirmed COVID cases per 100,000 people broken down by nations, you can see that England, Wales and Scotland are still increasing, but not as dramatically as Northern Ireland is. Northern Ireland seeing significant rises per head of population, which is helping to explain perhaps why Northern Ireland are going to be going into this 2-week circuit breaker in order to slow the spread of the disease, because it's taking off very rapidly there. Looking at this is just a sort of sanity check. This is the number of new tests per million of population in the 3 different nations. And you can see over the last week or so, it's remained relatively flat. And the point of this is just to illustrate that actually these cases are not because we're testing more people, it's because the number of infections is genuinely increasing across all 4 nations. The next graph, the next slide is a map of the United Kingdom. You can see regions where there have been the most or the largest increases in cases over the last week per 100,000 of population are in black, and then it goes down to red and dark yellow, and then to the lighter yellow. So you can see that the cases, as we have been aware for a while, are rising fastest in the northwest, to a slightly lesser extent in the northeast, but it's still a significant problem there. Northern Ireland as well, extremely high increases in cases, and then across large swathes of the Midlands and then into southern England. It should be said though that these places like the east of England and the southwest, which have got lower increases, actually that this light yellow colour goes from 0 to 50 new cases over the last week per 100,000 population. But actually, if you look at each of these, they're actually all very close to 50. So they're close to edging into this darker yellow colour. So cases are rising everywhere, but faster in the north and the Midlands, and to a slightly lesser extent in London. Again, breaking down, this is the new confirmed cases per 100,000 people by slightly larger regions. Again, you can see the northwest and northeast and Yorkshire are rising fastest, but cases are rising everywhere across the country. In particular, the Midlands is maybe a couple of weeks behind where the northeast and the northwest are. London a little bit further behind, but cases are rising in all of these regions, and we'll see that reflected in a minute in hospitalizations as well. This is again just another sanity check. This is the proportion of people testing positive in these different regions, and again you can see that it's increasing uniformly across the country, fastest in the north, and then in the Midlands and London. So again, it's showing that this is genuine increases in infections. This is not caused by increases in testing. If we look at a breakdown from number of cases increasing per 100,000 people by age, then we can see that actually, again, the 2 categories that are highest are the 10 to 19 year olds in grey and the 20 to 29 year olds in this aquamarine type colour here. You can see there has been a slight dip over the last week in the number of cases in 10 to 19 year olds, but they're still quite high. But again, the story is that cases are increasing in every demographic, and this is supported by the ONS. It's particularly worrying in 70 and 80 year olds down here, although the ONS this week has actually said that they may be leveling off in that age category, which is good news, because we know those are the most vulnerable people in the society. And then moving on to hospital admissions, so the blue bars are the daily admissions. This is just in England, and I've fitted very rough exponential growing curves here, and you can see that hospitalizations are doubling roughly every 2 weeks. So not as fast as in the first wave, but we know that hospitals in various parts of the country are getting close to capacity. So if these trends continue, that's not going to be good news. And similarly, if you break these hospital admissions down by region, it paints the same picture as you'd expect from cases. The north is rising very quickly. The Midlands and London and the other regions are also rising quickly, but at a slightly lower level. I think it can give us a false sense of security when we see these regions down here at a lower level than the north and think the problem's only confined to the north. So actually I've plotted this without the north and without the northwest and without the northeast in Yorkshire on the plot. And again, you can see that these trends are worrying. They're maybe 2 or 3 weeks behind where the Midlands is maybe 2 or 3 weeks behind where the northeast and the northwest are, but rising on the same sort of trend. And it's true even in the regions that have slightly lower cases like the southwest and the southeast and the east of England, they're also rising in terms of their hospital admissions. Then next is unfortunately moving on to death. So these are lagged by quite a while. So this data is for the week ending of the 2nd of October. So it's almost already 2 weeks out of date. That's the latest data we have across all the regions. So the blue is England and Wales, purple is Scotland, and yellow is Northern Ireland. So we've seen increases from 139 deaths 2 weeks ago to 234 last week, and then 333 for the week ending the 2nd of October. It's important to remember that deaths are lagged in comparison to cases by around 3 weeks. That's sort of the average time it takes to go from infection to dying if you do eventually die from the disease. And these data are a couple of weeks old, so it suggests that actually increases in deaths caused by the increase in cases that we're seeing are locked in for the next month at least. So these figures are only going to get worse for the next 4 or 5 weeks. I'll finish with an international comparison. So these are figures for daily reported cases in different countries in Europe, potentially comparable countries to the UK. You can see that the UK is sitting near the bottom of this league table. Currently, France are outstripping us. In fact, they had 30,000 cases announced yesterday. And actually, Italy and Germany are starting to increase, and Spain is decreasing. But clearly, and this shouldn't provide us with much comfort, the UK is still doing very poorly in this league table of new cases, and that's also reflected in hospitalizations per 100,000 people in the population. Again, France is at the top there. Spain is starting to come down, but the UK is right up there and rising quickly. So I'll just summarize by saying that the data is showing that COVID is continuing to spread quickly across the whole of the country, in particular in Northern Ireland, and that's why they've probably implemented this circuit breaker, and in particular in the north of England, but we know cases are rising everywhere. Hospital admissions similarly in the north of England rising rapidly, and actually within a week or two, maybe even only a week now, we'll be at the levels per head of population in terms of hospital admissions that London was seeing when when we were locked down on the 23rd of March. We know cases and hospitalizations are rising a bit more slowly than they were back in March, but still things are increasing and getting to very high levels. The first slide indicated that test, trace and isolate is still not doing particularly well. Case numbers are rising, and this is only going to make things worse. The new restrictions that have been brought in this week seem to make, well, we can't see what's happening in the data, but effectively not many people have been put into tighter restrictions than they were before. So they're likely to make little practical difference, and cases are going to continue to rise in the majority of areas. We'll await to see what impact this 3-tier system has, but while we wait to find out, this is allowing time for the virus to spread through the population. And so the message really is from the data, we need to act now, we need to act fast, and we need to act decisively in order to bring down cases. Hospitalizations and cases are high everywhere, and even in regions where we have lower numbers of cases, we need to act coherently to protect people in order to make sure that the rises in cases can be halted. And I think finally the government needs to halt this progress that we're seeing in all of these different metrics to reverse the growth. And so today we're going to propose a new emergency plan. I think Christina's going to take us through that, and a detailed blueprint for how to rebuild our faltering find, test, trace and isolate system. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kit. And yes, indeed, Professor Christina Pargel is now going to present Independent Sage's 6-week emergency plan to halt the spread of the virus that we've just been learning about. Christina.
Yeah, so hi everyone. So basically, as we just saw, the numbers aren't looking good. On the 21st of September, SAGE, the government SAGE group of scientists recommended a 2-week circuit breaker followed by some additional restrictions to bring cases down urgently. We now have daily cases that are 4 times what they were then. Hospital admissions and deaths are 3 times what they were then. So I think the time has come to say, we have to stop this. And so this is our 6 weeks plan, and it comes in 3 parts. And the first 2 parts are very much based on and draw on the SAGE proposals from mid-September. And so the first thing is just we have to stop the new cases, and we have to stop them everywhere. As Kit was saying, it may be true that some areas of England have lower case numbers than other areas of England, but everywhere is increasing. And there's no reason to think they're going to stop increasing. So why wait until it gets really bad before you try and stop that growth? So we propose a short circuit breaker for 2 to 3 weeks, no longer than 3 weeks, preferably 2 weeks. And in line with the SAGE minutes released last week, to return to late May restrictions. So not March, but May. But that includes closure of schools to coincide with half term, so effectively a 2-week half term. No indoor household mixing outside of support bubbles. The closure of non-essential retail and businesses, to reinstate 2-meter physical distancing, to work at home where at all possible. The ONS social survey released today showed that we're now working away from home more than we have been since March. We have to stop that. Closure of leisure and hospitality sectors, closure of places of worship, no overnight stays away from home, all university teaching online, but we can still meet people outside in public spaces, up to 6 people. So that's kind of the proposal. SAGE estimates that that would get R down to somewhere between 0.6 and 0.7. And what that means is that we should see cases and then following on from that, hospitalizations and death halve every week. And that will have a big impact. You won't see that impact for a couple of weeks because people who are going to be in hospital in 2 weeks probably already have the infection, but it will nonetheless, it will stop transmission and it will just stop it in its tracks. And that's what we have to do now. And then after that 2-3 weeks, when the circuit breaker ends, you still need some restrictions to keep R below 1, to keep cases going down just more slowly. And we want to allow schools to open. So to do that, and again, this is adapted from the SAGE minutes, we have to keep with some no indoor household mixing, keep the 2-meter physical distancing, keep working from home, keep pubs and leisure areas closed for now, keep university teaching online, but we can open non-essential businesses and retail. We can still meet outside in public spaces and schools can open, but we suggest that in secondary schools, pupils do now wear face coverings in classrooms as well as in corridors. And we think this would be 3 to 4 weeks. And why that amount of time? Because that's what you need to build a replacement for what we have now. That gives us an exit plan. So you probably need a circuit breaker anyway, but what we absolutely do not want is to end up in this cycle of repeating lockdowns, of it going up and then going down and going up and going down. So how do you do that? You have to build in a public health and social scaffold that lets us do away with some of these restrictions, but keep R below 1. And so at the same time that you're doing this, we want to spend 6 weeks, and that's how long we think it will take to build the public health scaffolding. So what does that mean? The first thing is financial support for all of those impacted by restrictions. That includes the original furlough scheme and support for self-employed, for affected workers and businesses. And that's good from a public health perspective because it lets people afford to stay at home and not go out and potentially transmit the virus. It's good from a moral perspective because if we're saying to people, you're not allowed to go out and earn your living, I think we have a duty to support people. And it's good from an economic perspective because it means you're not driving people into poverty and it helps your economy bounce back afterwards. It definitely means immediate and major reform of test and trace. That includes restructuring our testing infrastructure, it includes restructuring contact tracing, and it includes putting in wraparound support for people to isolate. We have to let people isolate if they're in contact or if they're sick with COVID. And Gabriel's going to be going through that in a minute. It also means a comprehensive reset of communications. Everything is still confusing. It means we have to explain the measures. It has to be clear and consistent. We have to avoid blame. I feel like, we have to avoid blaming people for the spread of COVID and working together to try and repress this virus. So we have to treat, each other and the public as a partner and not as a problem. And finally, we have to use these 6 weeks to build a better framework for making sure that spaces are COVID safe. It means making sure that we have the ability to shut down individual venues if they're not following social distancing guidelines, but it also means putting in place a package of support for businesses. Can they improve ventilation? Can we improve social distancing? Can we improve measures to improve everything so that it's safer for us to go into these spaces? And that includes other public spaces and it includes schools as well. And then what we hope is that if you do this 6-week plan, and it has to all come together, you don't want to do one without the other because then we're just stuck in this cycle. It means that we can then further relax restrictions as soon as you have a functioning find, test, trace, isolate and support system in place. And once case numbers are reduced to below 5,000 a day, and we think that you could do this in 6 weeks. And then from then on, the idea is that if you can stop cases rising, you can keep relaxing restrictions, but you have to do it slowly and you have to do it with this scaffolding in place. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Christina. Now we're going to go to Professor Gabriel Scala, who's going to be talking about what we can do about test, trace and isolate, given that it's not working as well as it should be. Gabriel.
Thank you, Alice. Following on very much from what Christina said, our emergency plan gives us an opportunity not only to get the virus back to a lower, much lower level, but it also gives us an opportunity to put the framework in place to make sure it stays there. If we don't take this opportunity, we are doomed to a Groundhog Day, where as soon as this period is over and things relax, we will go back up again. So our view is it's extremely important to take advantage of this, to do the one thing that we know isn't working in the whole system, and that is the NHS test and trace system. And we're putting forward a plan and a series of suggestions about how that should be done. This applies across the UK because NHS test and trace provides pillar 2 testing across the UK. Some of the tracing and contact, dealing with contacts is dealt with differently in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And so most of what we're saying applies to England, but it has implications across the whole of the United Kingdom. The key element to what we're positing as our response is that it must be locally based. The virus thrives in local communities, in local areas of this country. That is where it is spread, and it is spread by what goes on in those local communities. The only answer from a public health point of view is strong engagement of the testing, of the finding of cases, the contact tracing, the provision of isolation support. All of that has to happen and be coordinated at a local level. That's not what is happening now. In summary of what we're proposing in this document, we wish to see the replacement of the failed, falsely named and private sector-led NHS test and trace with a system for England which is rooted in the regions of England and in local areas. It must be integrated throughout with the National Health Service and must provide for the needs of people and the communities in which they live. In our view, NHS England should be the lead national organisation and should provide the infrastructure and logistics for the reorganisation and the functioning of an effective find, test, trace, isolate and support system. In each top-tier local authority in England, the local director of public health should have the leadership role and convene the necessary management structure in conjunction with the local NHS and indeed with the local authority. We have particular recommendations with respect to laboratory provision, and we believe that laboratory capacity in particular is crucial to our ability to control the virus throughout the UK. And Independent Sage calls for the establishment of a national COVID testing consortium, including all the current providers, and this consortium would operate under the auspices, oversight and management of the NHS. The final bullet point I want to put before you is about isolation and support. Isolation will not work unless people are supported to enable them to isolate. Self-isolation should be replaced by supported isolation with assistance if needed with accommodation, domestic assistance if needed, and financial support of up to £800 per week if needed. In summary, enough is enough. Fighting this virus without an effective find, test, trace, isolate and support system properly integrated and run at a local level by the NHS and with local authorities, fighting it without that is like fighting a battle with one hand tied behind your back. At the moment, we are doing that, and that is why we're losing. So this proposal for a new system runs alongside our emergency plan, and together those will give us the opportunity of getting this virus under control right across the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. And this is not new news, is it? This is what you've been saying right from the very beginning. This is how we get on top of this virus. So now I'm going to invite some questions from our live audience. And the first person to ask a question is Helen Khan, who's Director of Communities and Skills for the Greater London Authority. Halima, are you there?
Yes, thank you. I am. Good to be here. But I think, in fact, my question may have been superseded by your emergency plan. So what I was going to ask was a question about circuit breakers, the role that they could play, and in particular, what role they could play given the very different prevalence levels in different parts of the country. In fact, your emergency plan that you've just launched was very clear on that point. So I guess the question is there anything you'd like to add to what you've already said?
Christina.
So I would just add that the reason we think it has to be national is that all bits of the country are rising, and they are rising fast. And if you don't do anything, they're just going to keep rising. We don't believe the current restrictions are enough. I mean, most of the country's been living in tier 1 and tier 2 since mid-September, and cases are still going up a lot. So it's not clear why that would change now, just because they've got a different name. And if you did regional circuit breakers, well, it just means that the South has to do it in 3 weeks' time, and then at the cost of many more people getting sick. So we do it now together as a country and rebuild the system to let us come out of it.
Would anybody else like to comment on that? Zubaida?
I was going to add, the other thing is the whole reason the tier system came in, the traffic light system, was because the previous system of restrictions was so confusing and inconsistent. But what we have now is the government negotiating with local authorities on an area by area basis, where you have disparities, where, for instance, Lancashire can have their gyms open, but Liverpool can't. And so once again, it's getting very confusing with restrictions. So I think I would echo Christina's point, but also say that clarity is really important here. And it's really important that we're all in this together, given that the cases are high across the country.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move straight on to the next question, which is from Simon Duan. Simon.
Hello, yes. I think my question has been partly addressed by the data presented earlier, but it's really, I'm in England, in the east of England, to wonder whether the test and trace systems that we have in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland are any better than the one that we're suffering with in England.
So who would like to answer that question? So this is about disparity between the regions when it comes to test, trace, isolate. Gabriel.
You'll be a good person.
Gabriel.
Yeah, well, I've looked at this very closely in Northern Ireland, for example, and in that instance, it's impossible to say because they don't actually publish the data. One of the good things about NHS Test and Trace is there is actual data published, and we can see how well or more often how badly it's doing. And that lack of transparency, and I'm originally from Northern Ireland, so I follow that very closely, is really, really unhelpful. I do think Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have a substantial advantage, particularly Scotland and Wales, because they have got local health organisations in place in those two countries with directors of public health responsible for local areas, who I'm quite sure are on top of the system that they have. But again, it is fragmented, reliant upon different pillars of testing. And one of our proposals is that those testing pillars should be integrated so that there is a consistent and non-compartmentalized approach to testing in every part of the UK.
Dean, and you'd like to comment on that as well?
Yeah, thanks. Just to add to Gabriel's point and focusing on testing, the history of testing capacity and infrastructure in Wales and Scotland has been one of maintaining integration both between public health and the NHS and government. And this has not been necessarily the case in England, but But what that has led to is this immense separation, fragmentation in England in particular, between many different sorts of testing approaches and testing laboratories that are described as separate pillars, 4 separate pillars. And our proposal is to completely do away with that separation, take away that independent Deloitte's-led funding of the Lighthouse laboratories, bring them within an integrated NHS structure, and a very rapid 6-week plan to actually deliver that which is required. It's an essential component of then ensuring that at the end of a circuit breaker, we're back to a situation where we can truly monitor infections and keep infections low.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on that? Stephen Reicher.
Hi. Yeah, I live in Scotland and involved in the Scottish Advisory Group. So I want to make one general point, which is it is really important that we recognise that Independent SAGE is speaking not just for England, but for the UK. But secondly, that things are very different in different parts of the UK, and therefore some of the suggestions that we make that are relevant for England won't be relevant for Scotland. In terms of testing, I think the system is better in Scotland, but there are capacity issues in Scotland. And the limited capacity means, for instance, that there are limitations on policies, say, of mass testing, whether that's in the universities or elsewhere. So I think it points to the fact that there are problems, but they're different problems. The system works better, the system is more integrated, but as well as having a good system, of course, you've also got to have the capacity, not just the capacity for testing, but also the capacity for tracing and supporting people into self-isolation. It reinforces the importance of those elements.
So I see there's a question that one of our journalists wants to ask. It's A. Thompson. I'm sorry, I don't know your first name, but I can see that you're there, A. Thompson. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hello, everybody. It's Alexandra. I'd like a bit more clarity on, I think actually you did just cover this, whether this is a UK-wide or England. I'm just getting a bit muddled. Also, perhaps some sort of social experts can comment. What's the likelihood of people sort of adhering to this? My own personal experience of friends has really had enough now. The idea of a 2-week lockdown, people, do you not think, will mix in their own homes?
Susan Mickey, you'd like to answer that one?
Okay, well, yeah. I'll comment on the second part in particular. We often talk about the public as if there's some, this strange alien body. I mean, we are the public, right? And one of the problems a lot of the time is there is a tendency to talk about people as if people are somehow intellectually deficient and lack sense. And we've often been told throughout this pandemic that people are psychologically weak and they're not going to be able to put up with restrictions. We were told that in the first wave and it didn't prove true. And we're now being told it in the second wave, there will be fatigue. I think what we've found is that people are resilient and people will put up with restrictions if they achieve something. People will suffer for a cause, but people aren't stupid and they won't suffer if it's to no end. They won't suffer if there isn't a risk, and they won't suffer if the measures aren't going to deal with that risk. And people looking around, seeing measures which haven't worked, being told to abide by them again, quite reasonably conclude what's the point. If you have something consistent, if you have a plan like the plan that we've just outlined, where you can say to people, yes, it's going to be hard, but it's going to be worthwhile because it is going to achieve driving down the infection, and it is going to achieve keeping down the infection. And we're going to do something different from what we did in June, where we squandered the opportunity to put in place the scaffold that Christina talks about. We're going to put something in place that keeps those infections low. Then I think the evidence we've seen thus far and what we know about human psychology tells us, yes, people will be willing to put up with it. The problems and the failures don't lie in the fragility of human psychology. They lie in the ineptness of government and the inadequacy of the measures that they're putting forward. So my sense is, yes, our plan not only works in terms of public health, it is much more likely to achieve compliance and adherence from the public, in other words, from us, because people will show common sense and people understand that it's better to do something now than find ourselves in a complete disaster in a few weeks' time.
Thank you, Stephen. No mincing of words there. Susan, I know you want to comment on this as well.
Yes, I think we have to look at what the situation is at the moment. And at the moment, we have a mixed picture of different regions doing different things. We have uncertainty where we don't know what tier is going to come next. And we also have social divisions emerging, especially between the North and the South. And all of these undermine trust in the leadership, they undermine perceived fairness. And both of those things we know from evidence are associated with likelihood to adhere to the restrictions that are being asked of them. And we know what worked first time around was a sense of common purpose for the country, a sense of collective solidarity. And I think the advantage of a 2-week circuit break where the whole country is doing the same thing in the way that has been outlined here is on many different levels going to be much more successful than the current situation. And that includes the likelihood that people stick to and adhere to the guidelines.
Thank you, Susan. Next, we're going to Dr. Lindsay Broadbent, who's a virologist at Queen's University Belfast. Lindsay.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am in Northern Ireland, and as we've heard earlier, we're seeing a sharp rise in the number of cases here, and indeed in the number of hospitalisations. For example, on the 1st of October, there were 66 inpatients with COVID, and as of the 15th of October, there were 201. So a really steep increase. As I'm sure everyone here is aware, we're also going into a circuit breaker lockdown tomorrow, or as of this evening, really, and that will last for 4 weeks of increased measures. A lot of this is based off the SAGE modelling, and I was just wondering, really, I have 2 parts to my question. The first part of which is, how reproducible and translatable do you think the SAGE modelling is to each of the 4 corners of the UK? Can the SAGE modelling really be as accurate for somewhere like Northern Ireland as it is for England or the UK as a whole? And secondly, really, I'd really like your opinion on what other data you think should be published, and specifically data that might actually be able to get the general public on side and cooperating with some of these measurements. For example, anecdotally, we know from a few months ago here, there was a karaoke party from which a large cluster of cases developed, and I have not heard of anyone having a karaoke party since. So I wonder if it would be useful to know the source of some of these clusters. Are they occurring in hospitality? Are they occurring in education or workplace settings? And we just do not see that data.
Thank you very much. So that was a 2-part question. The first part was about modelling. So I wonder if Kit, you'd be able to speak to that.
Kit's had to go teach. So
I'm going to, right. So
I mean, I can say something quickly if you want.
All right, and then Carl, I'll probably come to you.
Yeah. So just on the modelling, I mean, a circuit breaker is quite a severe intervention, and what it basically does is it stops people mixing, and that doesn't really require that much modelling to be sure it will work. And we saw it's been working around the world in terms of stopping transmission in its tracks, and it does have quite a big impact, quite an immediate big impact. It's just comes with a lot of attendant harms, which is why you really don't want to go there. But when there are few options left, which is kind of where we believe we find ourselves in now, then a short, sharp circuit break will certainly have an effect on transmission.
And Carl, would you like to comment on the modelling aspect of that question as well, please?
Sure. So the question about whether generic models will apply to England or Northern Ireland, it's a very good question. I think the way in which these models are structured and the way that they are parameterized makes them equally applicable to any region, nation, and indeed local authority. I think the underlying question, though, is the predictions that ensue from those modelings are going to be very dependent upon the current state of that particular region. So the predictions will certainly have an enormous regional variation depending upon the prevalence of infection in your area. And I noticed that in the chat somebody's asking about ideas about preemptive circuit breakers, and I think the word preemptive is quite important here, because it says it really does matter when you introduce a circuit breaker, and you really want to do it before things have got out of control. And of course, with that notion, it means that the timing of any circuit breaker for each of the 4 nations may actually be slightly different. So I think it's a sensitive question. On the other hand, just going back to one of the previous points about is this circuit breaker a national, a UK, or an English thing? If it is the case that the secondary and possibly tertiary waves are caused by spread of the virus through the country, then we not only have to consider the person-to-person transmission within a particular regional community, but also on a larger scale, the community-to-community transmission. So an additional argument for a homogeneous approach, even if it seems inappropriate for places like Cornwall or possibly London now, would be that you can attenuate between region communication, which is an important dynamic in shaping the collective response. Your final question about it would be great to have lots of data about amplification events, super spreading events. I think one of the motivations for the underlying message that Independent Sage is trying to promote, which is when we have set the right conditions with a circuit breaker, then we really need to use that time to get localized contact tracing and possibly backward contact tracing in play, which can only be done on the ground locally. You can only have access to those data in a meaningful way with local contact tracing and identifying cluster events. And then we get a much better, then we can generate those data. Those data will be made available, and we'll have a much better sense as to what's actually promulgating the current viral spread.
Carl, thank you very much. I need to go on to the next question, but Gabriel, I know that you wanted to speak quickly to that question as well.
Thanks, Lindsay, for joining us today. I think the information issue is a really crucial one, and I can't find the data in Northern Ireland about the number of test results received within 24 hours, etc., etc. And I think all that sort of data is very important, that people know that the system is working. There's real problems, of course, in the border counties now about high rates in the Republic of Ireland, in the counties abutting Northern Ireland, and that cries out for the integrated approach that we were promised in the Memorandum of Understanding, and which has never really happened. And finally, the issue of settings. Northern Ireland, for some reason, has taken a completely different definition to anywhere else of settings. And I find that quite, well, most of the information stuff I find very peculiar. And I think settings is very important. For example, in discussion with people from the hospitality sector in Northern Ireland, they don't have the data about what the numbers are of events that have cropped up in their sector compared to all clusters. So I think information is absolutely vital. Thank you for the asking.
Thank you very much. And moving on to the next question now, which comes from Claire Wilson of New Scientist. Claire.
Hello, thank you very much for taking my question. Yes, I was the one asking about preemptive circuit breakers. The idea that you introduce a short, sharp lockdown before you really need to because of the numbers of cases, but with the benefit that because it is planned in advance, it would reset cases back down to a lower level, and everybody knows when it's coming, so businesses can plan around that, and they know when it's going to end, because it might be, for instance, 2 weeks, maybe done 6 times a year to coincide with every school half-term and full-term holiday that there is. That is one proposal that there has been discussion about this week. So Cole Fiston very kindly just touched on that very briefly, but could anybody else on the panel please comment on whether they think that idea would be a good idea in the future? I realise it's too late to have a preemptive one now because we're now in the emergency situation, but how about planning it for, say, the whole of the next year?
Christina, if you'd like to comment on that first.
I mean, just to say that I think it'd be better than having last minute emergency circuit breakers, but we don't believe we need it. That's why we've suggested the 6-week rebuilding of a public health scaffolding, that if you do it right, you don't need any more lockdowns. It's not saying you won't need any restrictions. There probably will need to be some restrictions in place alongside contact tracing, but things like social distancing, wearing a mask, things like that. We don't want to keep closing things. And I feel like to plan for that is an admission of failure. Like, other countries have done it. We can do it. It's not beyond us to do it as a country. So that's my view on it.
And I think, Anthony, you wanted to comment on this too.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're in a pandemic which is going to cause the deaths of millions of people around the world. And we've already had in this country more deaths than occurred during the Blitz, the Second World War. And infections generally always cause much worse problems than war. So I don't want this to become a sort of party political thing. We do need a national unity, and whichever party we vote for, we're all largely Democrats and believe in a mixed market economy. Now, the idea is, and it comes back to an earlier question, 3 weeks ago, Sage asked for a circuit breaker and the government said no. They went for this 3-tier process. And the reason was largely backbench pressure, business pressure, a lot of people saying that we can't go through this yet again. And the worry about it is that the longer you wait, the worse it's going to be. And I think one of the problems is, and I've heard this from the Prime Minister, from Chris Whitty, and last night from Sir Mark Walpert, is this false dichotomy. They say, well, you've got, the health problem, but we've got to worry about the economy. And that's why we need to get a balance and delay. And I think that is actually mistaken. If you go back to March, we were very slow to go into our lockdown. We hit an exponential part of the curve and we had a massive problem trying to get back under control. And the costs, the second quarter economic costs were $140 billion, pounds. Sorry, we're in the UK, aren't we? 140 billion pounds, which was 20% of our GDP. Korea lost 3%, Germany 9%. So I think from an economic perspective, we need to do it. Now, your argument about repeat lockdowns, I think would cost much more. It's something that, Adam Kucharski at the London School has suggested, but I think the alternative of putting in place a proper NHS integrated test and trace would be much more effective in the longer run, and we could keep it under control, rather like China, Korea, Finland, Norway, and to a lesser extent, Germany and others have done.
Thank you very much. And I know there were other people wanting to answer that, but I want to squeeze in a couple of questions now from the University of Nottingham's official student magazine, Impact. The first one from Aiden Hall. Aiden.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you. So as you all probably know, the University of Nottingham has experienced some of the highest COVID cases numbers of any university in the UK, with daily recorded numbers exceeding over 1,500 amongst students alone just last week. The University of Nottingham, however, didn't halt in-person teaching like many other universities did, such as Manchester, Sheffield. And as a result of the decision, the university has come under quite a bit of criticism. So my question is this criticism fair? Is there, in fact, any evidence to suggest that the spread of the virus amongst the student population did, in fact, occur during the hours of in-person teaching, all of which, I might add, was conducted with strict social distancing, wearing face coverings, and in thoroughly cleaned rooms?
So is that criticism fair, given the apparently COVID-secure nature of the teaching? Deanan.
Thanks very much for the question. Many of us on panel work in universities and so forth, so all have our own experiences of our own situations, and clearly it's very difficult for universities to come up with the right answer here. Firstly, I want to applaud Nottingham in the way they developed a testing infrastructure. Very well done between the university and local NHS, and I'm sure that's helped to identify where infections are. But with regard to face-to-face teaching, the question about face-to-face teaching, we've got to remember that face-to-face teaching involves not only sitting in classrooms, is actually walking around the university. There are staff amongst the university, security staff, canteen staff, and so forth, who then are increased risk. And it is that, particularly that bridge between younger people who will have less risk, not negligible, but less risk of getting disease themselves, but actually also passing that on not only to themselves, but those around. And that's a principle here about why we're increasingly, urgently pushing for online teaching alone, to actually reduce the risk, not only to students, but those around who work in these large conurbation, which are universities.
And Stephen, you wanted to comment on that too.
Yes. Because universities have been marketised, vice-chancellors are effectively in the same position as pub owners. They fear that if they lose consumers, students, because they don't give in-person teaching, then they will lose money and they will go bankrupt. And a lot of universities are in dire financial straits. And therefore they try and fudge things, and they try and keep in-person teaching despite the public health risk. Vice-chancellors are wrong to continue with in-person teaching, but they need the support so they can make things safe. So equally, in exactly the same way that if we put restrictions on pubs, the government has got to support those businesses and those workers. Similarly in universities, so we can go to in-person teaching and do the right thing, the government needs to give support to universities and to make sure that staff don't suffer either.
Thank you. I'm now going to invite another question from the University of Nottingham from Kit Sinclair. Kit.
Hi, yeah. Thanks for having me on. I was just going to ask, so a lot of the media attention about cases amongst students is focused on students living in university-owned halls, but actually in Nottingham, if you look at the data, and I think it's the case for a lot of unis, the majority of cases are in students living in private accommodation, so amongst the wider community. And yet, obviously in Nottingham, and again in a lot of other unis, I mean, we haven't been put in the higher tier, even though the cases are highest tier, and a lot of the speculation is because people think that it's only going around students who are at lower risk. But for that majority of cases among students living in private accommodation, is there a risk to the wider local community? Because a lot of us live amongst, elderly, vulnerable people. Yeah.
So what about the wider community around universities? Zubaida, would you like to answer that one?
Yes, no, I think it's a very good point. Whenever we think of students, we assume that they're just living in accommodation, but a large portion of students are not only living in private accommodation, but they're also living still in family homes, in overcrowded family homes, in family homes that are not necessarily well off. And we've forgotten the context of that. And we've forgotten the context that universities and schools largely reflect the areas in which they live in. So if local coronavirus cases are high, then they will be high in schools and they will be high in universities. We know, of course, that universities also bring the extra dimension of students coming from different places, but it's really important to take that into account. One of the things that we've stopped taking into account is right from the outset, we knew certain communities were much more vulnerable. We knew that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were much more vulnerable, elderly were much more vulnerable, but also Black and ethnic minority groups. And a lot of Black and ethnic minority groups live in urban areas where there are universities. This is all important to consider, but this is why we need a short, sharp circuit breaker across the country, because we need to think about the vulnerable. In a way, the government have stopped talking about vulnerable people. So I think we need to go back to that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go straight on actually to the final question, because it really does lead on from that. And this comes from Marnie Dixon. Marnie, are you there?
Hello, I am. Yes, hi all. I just had a question in regards to, do you suggest that shielding should be resumed? I mean, there are an awful lot of vulnerable people who are key workers and have been forced back to work in unsafe environments. And I was just wondering if there was any talk of that being resumed.
Who would like to answer that? Christina?
So, yes, I do think so. And partly because the Office of National Statistics and their infection survey today said we're now at the highest levels of infection that they've seen since they started testing, since they started recording, and that was in May. And shielding didn't stop until, what, August? So in what sense was it the right thing to do in May, June, July, and not the right thing to do now? I think the only thing I would change about it is I think we should still say that, you know, if you're shielding, it is okay to meet up with people outside, because I think that way, you know, you can't, shutting off people from social contact, human contact is something we should avoid. And we know that actually you can meet safely outside with 2 meter distancing. So that's what I think about it.
Anthony, you'd like to comment as well?
Yeah, just to say that shielding is not just about preventing grandmothers from, you know, dying aged 85. It's also about all the people with underlying conditions. But another reason to get the levels right down is we cannot underestimate the potential disaster of what's happening with long COVID. Every day I'm reading new papers about cardiac effects, Parkinson's, long-term effects on high blood pressure and the like. And let's say it's 10 to 20 times more common than the number of people who die. That's well over 1 million people, and that will have a huge economic impact on the National Health Service. So the idea that, you know, the popular view is that anyone under 60, this is a trivial illness, is not true. And we're collecting more and more evidence about that. And I think, therefore, that's why we would argue, don't just have repeat circuit breakers and let it rise up in between. Try to suppress this virus so that we can get it under control. And that way, and wait for the vaccine. I mean, you know, ultimately, we've either got to get a vaccine or we've got to get this virus to mutate itself into something much less virulent.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That's the end of our live questions, and that's the end of the discussion for today. But I'm going to invite Sir David King to say a few words in conclusion, as is our tradition.
Thank you very much, Alice. I think what everyone will have heard is that Independent Sage has come up with what I consider to be a fully coherent strategy that needs to be applied right away. And I say right away because everyone around the country recognizes that the longer we leave it, the more difficult it would be, again, as it was in March, to get it under control, the more costly it will be to our economy, and the more costly it will be in terms of fatalities and the health of the nation. So this coherent strategy is to back the SAGE proposal of a circuit strategy that was made 3 weeks ago and where no action was taken. But we're also putting forward a 6-week plan. And this is where it becomes a strategy. Because if this 6-week plan is followed to develop a new attempt to get a contact tracing system functioning, and I say attempt, we've got to make it work. Nobody comes out of an epidemic without contact tracing. Otherwise, you end up using this blunt instrument of a lockdown. So we need this. And the public health scaffolding that has been put forward in this meeting provides a coherent way of developing that. We're saying 2 weeks, we're going to this circuit breaker, and then 3 or 4 weeks on under further controls in terms of managing to keep the R level in the country down well below 1, so that it's not increasing, but still decreasing, but not as quickly. me just stress again the point that Anthony was making about this false dichotomy between economy and the health of the nation. This all began in March this year. Haven't we in government learned the lesson from that? That as a result of delays in going into lockdown and as a result of the serious problems around doing the test, trace, isolate policy, we are now at the worst impact on economy compared with other countries right across Europe. But we're also at the worst level of deaths in the country. So we got hit both ways. Aren't we going to come out of it now? I once again say, Prime Minister, please act right away. Follow this advice. Begin it tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir David. Thank you to our panel once again, and thank you to everybody who's been watching. Please publicise Independence Age. Please share the link, and you can watch this briefing online. There will be a recorded version there. Also, all the reports that have been published by Independence Age over the weeks and months are available on the website, including this new emergency plan, which we are recommending today. Do follow Independence Sage on Twitter if you don't already, and we will be back same time, same place next Friday. Have a good weekend. Stay safe. Keep well.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.